Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, which is a partnership between War on the Rocks and the University of Texas at Austin. My name is Rick Landgraf, Managing Editor of the Texas National Security Review. Traditional understandings of military alliances argue that a formal treaty underpinning the security relationship is crucial for deepening and rendering more efficient defense cooperation between countries. However, Sweden and Finland's cooperation with NATO prior to 2022, when the two countries announced their intentions to formally join the alliance, was far more substantial than what rationalist explanations would expect. Traditional approaches to military alliances overlook the importance of identity-based considerations that come with being a formal member of an alliance. Accordingly, not only is signing a treaty functionally important, it is also significant in terms of what it implies for national identity in terms of security policy. For Sweden and Finland, this suggests that the greatest change with NATO membership will be with regard to identity and strategic culture. In the wake of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, both Sweden and Finland, two longtime Western-aligned but officially militarily neutral states, chose to pursue membership in NATO. Finland joined in April 2023, and Sweden joined in March 2024, becoming the 32nd member of the alliance. What prompted this sea change in Swedish and Finnish national security policymaking? Why did they choose this pathway in 2022 and not sooner? And perhaps most importantly, what does NATO membership mean for Sweden and Finland? In this episode of Horns of Dilemma, we address these questions and many others. Our first guest is Catherine Elgin. She is a fellow at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. Previously, she was a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, where she wrote and published on grand strategy, great power relations, U.S. defense strategy, European security, and alliance management. Dr. Elgin has worked at the Brookings Institution with a long-term strategy group in Washington, D.C. In 2018, she served as a visiting fellow at the Institute for Security and Development Policy in Stockholm, Sweden. She has a PhD in Public Affairs from Princeton University's School of Public and International Affairs. Catherine, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's great to be calling in from Stockholm.
Also joining us is Alexander Lanoshka. He is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and the Balsillie School of International Affairs at the University of Waterloo in Canada. He is also an associate fellow at the UK-based Council on Geostrategy, senior fellow at the Ottawa-based MacDonald-Laurier Institute, and a visiting professor at the College of Europe in Nadolin, Warsaw, Poland. His research focuses on alliance politics and military strategy, with an emphasis on Central and Eastern Europe. He is published in leading peer-reviewed journals such as International Security, International Studies Quarterly, International Affairs, and Security Studies. He has also co-written policy monographs on Baltic security and Taiwanese defense strategy. His books include Atomic Assurance, The Alliance Politics of Nuclear Proliferation, and Military Alliances in the 21st Century. He also holds a PhD from Princeton. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you very much. I'm a longtime fan of the podcast, and so I'm very much delighted to speak with you alongside Catherine today.
Today we're going to look back at your article that was published in the spring 2023 issue of TNSR. The article is entitled Sweden, Finland, and the Meaning of Alliance Membership. Alex, I'm going to ask the first question to you. What prompted you to write this piece?
Catherine and I have been meaning to write about Scandinavian/Baltic security for a while. In fact, this piece has its origins really in 2019 when we started to brainstorm a possible project together. What precipitated this particular paper was yet another paper that was written by Alexander Korolev that examined the tightness of this Sino-Russian security partnership. And in that paper, he argues that those two countries, China and Russia, are essentially on the verge of an alliance in accordance with various measures of security cooperation. And we thought that if Russia and China are on the verge of an alliance, then what does that make Sweden and Finland? Moreover, come 2020, I was working separately on a book project that would become my second book, Military Alliances in the 21st Century. And in that particular book, I made the argument that a useful way of defining alliances, or rather distinguishing alliances from other forms of security partnership, is that military alliances ultimately involve some sort of written down treaty. What is interesting about the Swedish and Finnish security partnership with NATO or NATO countries prior to 2022 is that they exhibited very high levels of cooperation and collaboration, so much so that they exceeded what we see in some formal security arrangements like the Chinese-North Korean military alliance, notwithstanding the fact that, again, there was no such written down commitment between Sweden and Finland on the one hand and NATO countries on the other hand. So we had these puzzles that we were interested in unlocking, and that more or less provided the basis for the paper that would eventually be published by the Texas National Security Review.
And yet you mentioned in your article, and you mentioned in your response about your methodology for this and how you used the paper about Russia and China's alignment and increasing cooperation over the past several years. Can you talk a little bit about your definition of alliances and alliance formation? Because in this paper, you use a bit narrower definition than traditional kind of conventional theories of alliance formation. I'm talking in terms of like Stephen Walt. So can you talk a little bit about why for this paper you felt that there were really important difference between a formal alliance with a written treaty versus more of an informal relationship?
So many security analysts and journalists often invoke the term alliance to cover a broad spectrum of security partnerships. And you mentioned Stephen Walt's canonical work, The Origin of Alliances, wherein he does talk about informal, meaning non-institutionalized, unwritten security partnerships, and formal arrangements as all being alliances. For Catherine and I, that is a mistake, in part because with respect to a set of cases like Sweden and Finland, that would lead you to the mistaken view that prior to 2022, Sweden and Finland were already military allies of the United States, or for that matter, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But if you were to take that view, then you're not going to be able to truly make sense of what had taken place in 2022 when those two countries did make the formal decision to join the alliance. And so as much as there are a number of security partners that seem to be worthy of the term alliance, I think having that distinction does make a lot of sense and does have a lot of policy relevance, in part because it allows us to usefully distinguish between different forms of security cooperation.
And just to rewind a little bit, and I know we're kind of getting into the theory a little bit, but I think this is important because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding of what NATO is, what NATO isn't, differences. There's a lot of loose talk out there in regards to whether a state is an ally or a partner. Within NATO discourse, these are very tightly defined terms, and they have a lot of meaning, specific meaning behind them. Can you talk a little bit about why states form alliances?
There's a bit of an X factor involved in why states form military alliances. I think, again, the definition is useful in part because a written down treaty carries with it a different set of obligations, typically legal obligations that have weight both in international and domestic law. Internationally registered treaties certainly implicate the reputation of countries much, much more, precisely because they're public facing and they stake to a certain extent the credibility of those countries involved. When arrangements remain informal, that is to say, primarily verbal or tacit, then it's very easy for participant countries to walk away from any sort of pledges precisely because they don't carry the sort of legal implications or reputational consequences that formal arrangements might have. Now, whether or why countries form military alliances is really a result of multiple factors. There's no one single factor. It could be the result of shared threat perceptions. It could be the result of ideological affinity. It could be the result that countries are comfortable enough that they're not going to be taken for a ride by another, or for better or for worse. And so they feel confident that they can undertake a rather institutionalized form of security cooperation. But I tend to resist those explanations that focus simply on one factor. I think the Swedish and Finnish cases are indicative in this regard. If you think it's all about the balance of threats that those countries have in how the balance of threat shapes their alliance decisions, then you might think that Sweden and Finland would join NATO much sooner than it really did, especially after 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and the destabilization of the Donbass in Ukraine.
Catherine, I want to turn to you now. You rightly point out in the article that a lot of the attention over Sweden and Finland's accession into NATO has been about what NATO gains from this process. What does NATO gain from two more members in the alliance and consolidating Northern Europe and Scandinavia? But you, I think, rightly point out this is a research gap, and what's really not the most crucial. The most crucial factor is really what does Finland and Sweden gain from becoming members of the alliance. So I want to ask, what kind of reaction has this argument received thus far?
No, that's exactly right. And I will say that the article is perfectly timed in a sense. So as Alexander mentioned, we started thinking about this in 2019, and the piece wasn't released until just after Finland formally joined the alliance. And so the reception has been good, I would say. It was perfectly timed because people began to seek explanations for what was happening. So we were on sort of the forefront of the more theoretical thinking about why Sweden and Finland were joining. And that allowed us, I believe, to really make an impact on particularly the academic conversation around this. But I do also want to highlight that you are exactly right on this point about what do Finland and Sweden gain. Of course, NATO gains two very strong members in their accession. And on the Swedish and Finnish side, one, of course, is the clear Article 5 pledge, right? That NATO members will come to their aid if they are attacked, and vice versa. Sweden and Finland are now obligated to do the same for other NATO members. They will be able to participate and be automatically involved in political consultations. In the past, they had to be invited, and they will be participate directly in joint military planning alongside other advantages as well. And since Sweden and Finland had been so close to the alliance prior to joining, these advantages really do matter. But for us, the question really became, what changes here? In addition to these advantages, what are the big changes? And that's where we landed on this argument about identity to try to explain why they hadn't joined previously.
And Catherine, I know you're joining us from Stockholm. I want to turn a little bit into kind of the differences between Finland and Sweden. So I think too often people group these two countries together because they expressed a desire to join the alliance at the same time in the wake of Russia's invasion. But Finland joined a year earlier for a couple different reasons. But one of those is that the process in Sweden took a little bit longer due to domestic politics and due to the strategic culture within Sweden. Can you talk a little bit about the differences between Sweden and Finland in this regard?
Sure. So I think we should first clarify that both countries sought to join NATO at the same time. So they both declared their intent to apply for the alliance in May of 2022. But the process for Sweden to officially join took much longer, in large part because there were delays from Turkey and Hungary for the accession itself. But so just to clarify, they both joined in very short succession, nearly at the same time. That being said, you are right. So they are two different countries with different strategic cultures, different, though close, geographies, and different histories. And part of what we go into the piece is the importance of this history. So, for example, during the Cold War, in part due to the Winter War and the continuation war, Finland was in a bit of a precarious position and ended up signing what is called the Treaty on Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance with the Soviet Union, which essentially meant that Finland was neutral. They pursued this treaty for a number of reasons, in part because after these wars, the Soviet Union had demanded heavy war reparations. They'd forced Finland to lose support. They took roughly 1/10 of Finnish territory, and they'd imposed limitations on the Finnish military. Sweden, on the other hand, remained officially neutral. But it was in part because it was sensitive to this geopolitical context. There was a fear that if Sweden joined NATO, they might leave Finland behind, and that's not something that they wanted to do. And so Sweden remained neutral throughout the Cold War. However, it was clearly leaned towards the West. It was understood that if there were to be a war in Europe, that Sweden would fight on the side of the West. And Sweden was very strong militarily. So you have a difference in history there. As you go through the 1990s, there also increasingly grows a difference in strategic culture. The Finns never really relax as much as other European countries do during the so-called peace dividend. And the Finns are always aware of the threat across their border. Sweden, however, takes more advantage of the peace dividend. And so by the time the Russia threat begins to reemerge in the first decade of the 2000s, Sweden has a bit of catching up to do. That being said, both Sweden and Finland throughout the 1990s and the 2000s grew closer and closer to NATO as part of their own national strategies. They joined the Partnership for Peace. They later became enhanced opportunity partners with the alliance. And so while, again, each country is very different, they sort of followed similar paths towards NATO beginning in the 1990s. And that's, I think, part of the reason why we talk about them together in this way.
You mentioned about how both countries generally join the alliance very rapidly, much faster than a lot of other countries that desire to join NATO. You know, I think a big part of this conversation is the fact that both Finland and Sweden are European Union members and have been for a very long time. And the EU and NATO obviously have a large overlapping membership. Finland was actually the only country, the first country that has joined both organizations to actually join the EU first and then NATO. Previously, it's been seen that NATO is sort of a stepping stone to EU membership. With Sweden's accession, Sweden is now the second country to do that. But you also talk about strategic culture and how a big benefit of membership is a change in identity and a change in orientation and a change of how other countries look at Sweden and Finland. And I want to just press on that a little bit and ask the question, and Alex, we'll go back to you on this, is what hadn't that already been achieved with EU membership, since both these countries had been EU members for many, many years?
One might think, because Article 42.7 of the Lisbon Treaty basically amounts to a mutual defense clause. However, the way that it is written is in fact very much respectful of the geostrategic orientations of the member states themselves. It more or less enshrines the supremacy of NATO while acknowledging the neutral status of particular EU members. And so from the perspective of Sweden and Finland, it was not sufficient to meet the threat that Russia had presented, especially in the context of the full-scale invasion in 2022. At least with respect to Finland, I have seen a number of observers make the argument that what that invasion revealed is that Russia was very willing to go about nuclear saber rattling in such a way as to intimidate and to block potential intervention on the part of members of the Western Alliance to help Ukraine, especially in the early days of that full-scale invasion. And so precisely because the nuclear umbrella, so to speak, is much more associated with NATO, NATO had that appeal, at least with respect to Finland. So the fact that Russia was using the nuclear shield, as it were, to fend off any sort of Western challenge to its own activities in Ukraine was indeed something very critical and certainly pointed to the insufficiency of the European Union commitment, even though on paper you would think it does amount to alliance as per the definition that I've mentioned. All the same, no country really seriously sees the European Union as a military alliance first and foremost.
Sorry, I was going to say, if I can also help in here to go back to your identity question, I think there's one of the first questions you need to ask when you think about identities is which identities? So Finland and Sweden clearly already had an identity as EU members. They were generally accepted into the Western club, but they were non-allied and they were not NATO members. And so you can hold these multiple identities at once. And then, as Alexander and I go through in this article, what really changes is that identity question towards being allied and towards being, in particular, a NATO ally. You still maintain the identity as an EU member, and you still maintain the identity as a Western state, but you add to it this other layer of identity.
Catherine, this piece was written about a year ago. Well, it was written obviously much longer than that. It's been in making for a while, as Alexander alluded to. But in the year since it's been out, I want to ask if you had an opportunity to add a bit more or things that were left on the cutting room floor. Can you elaborate on some of the points that you might add to a follow-on piece?
I think for me, in an ideal world, we would have written two pieces, one for Sweden and one for Finland. That is not what we did for many reasons, space being one of them. But I think, really being able to dig into the differences between the two countries would have been really valuable. And I hope that that's something that either the two of us or somebody else takes up in the future. There's indeed already been work on each individual country since we published this. Otherwise, however, I think the piece has held up very well, and I am proud of it. One thing that I think would be really interesting to dig into is the ways in which the membership has really increased cooperation. If we could really look at policy changes, the internal conversations in Helsinki and Stockholm about membership, really doing a deep dive now into perhaps relooking at the measures that we use in the article, that we use in methodology from Karolov. If we could revisit that now, that would be very interesting. But that's not necessarily change the pitch as much as really looking at updating it. I don't know if Alexander has other thoughts.
I do have other thoughts. So one argument often made about alliances in general is that when they're institutionalized and formalized as what NATO represents, they are much more efficient and that they provide much more efficient modes of cooperation than what is otherwise the case. What is interesting about Sweden and Finland is that they already achieve fairly high levels of institutionalization according to particular metrics, even before 2022. And so the question one can have is whether there is even more efficiency as a result of their membership. Yes, they are members now of the North Atlantic Council, and they can participate as much as they want in various NATO structures. But there have been analysts and policymakers expressing concern over the course of the last year or two that there's still a lot of work to be done, especially around the Baltic littoral region, that cooperation is not as significant as one would hope, that the region, especially as of late, has become very prone to GPS jamming on the part of Russian forces, that the response on the part of NATO to these sorts of provocations remains very limited and at worst half-hearted. And so one wonders to what extent things have proceeded as efficiently or as productively as one might expect now that they're full-fledged members of the alliance. I suspect they are, but there are these issues that remain. And again, that speaks to the very founding puzzle that motivated this paper in the first place, considering how much institutionalization there was in their relationship, what is the actual value added of their actual membership, and what it actually means to be a formal signatory to a piece of paper. There is quite a bit of benefit, as what Catherine had mentioned in her earlier answer, but there are still these concerns that nevertheless preoccupy the attention of many practitioners and policymakers in and around the Baltic region.
Okay, last question, and I'll ask it to both of you, but it's hard to talk about this topic, NATO and Sweden and Finland, NATO enlargement. It's hard to talk about this topic now without bringing up Ukraine, Georgia, and other countries that aspire to join the alliance. And for many years, NATO has had what's called this membership action plan, which is that formal stamp of approval that countries that aspire to join are granted a membership action plan and set on a pathway to joining the alliance. But Sweden and Finland both joined without a membership action plan. Does this create a double standard in terms of of states that want to join the alliance. Now, I know NATO has said that the Ukraine has moved past the need for a membership action plan, but presumably this requirement would apply to other aspirant states. Alexander, can you comment on that a little bit?
I would say that the cases of Sweden and Finland are very peculiar precisely because of the reasons that we mentioned, that already prior to 2022, those countries exhibited very high levels of cooperation with NATO already, to the extent that their membership was far more imaginable than what is the case for Georgia and Ukraine. Moreover, in 1995, NATO, when it commissioned a study on the conditions under which it may expand or accept new members, determined that countries did have to resolve what territorial disputes they might have. Sweden and Finland do not have active territorial disputes with Russia. Of course, there's friction with Russia, and those can be manifest territorially, but they're certainly not to the same extent as what is the case with Georgia and Ukraine that do have very live and ongoing territorial disputes.
Catherine, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I will just echo the fact that I think Sweden and Finland do represent unique cases for NATO enlargement. And one should also highlight that the Partnership for Peace program, which helps to nurture official ties between countries that are not part of NATO and the alliance, was seen differently in Sweden and Finland than in some other states. In Sweden and Finland, it seems like Partnership for Peace was never a precursor to membership, and rather it was a way to grow official ties with the alliance. And so they are unique. And given the amount of cooperation that they'd already had with NATO prior to their decision to seek membership, given the ways in which their militaries had developed, I think these are really unique cases, and that's part of the reason why they make for such interesting research.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks for listening to Horns of Dilemma. Catherine, Alexander, thanks for joining the show.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to read the Texas National Security Review, which you can find at tnsr.org.